Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from the Gerha Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we're very honored to have with us Professor Wojciech Piotrowicz. And the title of his webinar is Humanitarian Logistics and its Imperative in the Era of COVID-19. Professor Wojciech is an associate professor in supply chain management and social responsibility at Hanken School of Economics in Finland. His research is focused on supply chain technology, performance metric in various contexts, such as retail, including omni-channel, humanitarian, manufacturing. In addition, he works on other supply chain related themes, such as humanitarian logistics, supply chain risk, resilience, and flow under conflict conditions. He's been working with commercial organizations, public sector, and NGOs, looking at both similarities and differences between supply chain designs. Without much ado, I want to pass to Wojciech, and I really thank you for being with us today. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Auni. I'm really grateful for this invitation and opportunity to share my research, but also some thought on humanitarian logistics and the current pandemics. So today I'll be talking about humanitarian logistics in wider context, about linking it with supply chain risk, and also putting some connections with the COVID response, especially at the early stage of the pandemics. So I thank you for introduction, but I will tell you a bit more about me and HUMLOG Institute. Then I will go back to basics, to humanitarian logistics, what we really understand by this term, go a bit deeper into disaster management cycle, and finally looking at links between humanitarian logistics and COVID-19. And of course, the most important part later means questions or answers. We have around half an hour, 20-something minutes for that. So if you have any questions, please write it down, and I'm happy to discuss with you that later, of course, if I will be able to answer everything. So thank you for the introduction. So I'm leading HUMLOG Institute. I'm associate professor in supply chain social responsibility, but also I'm linked with the University of Oxford, with my former college, with Wolfson College, where actually I met Professor Auni during our collaboration on one of the books on supply chain emerging markets, which actually led me to focus more on humanitarian logistics. So first about the HUMLOG Institute. So we are proud to be the first research institute focused on humanitarian logistics. So Hanken HUMLOG, it was the place where humanitarian logistics was born as a field of research, as academic discipline or subdiscipline of supply chain and logistics research. It is already over decades since we started to work on this topic. We were first, but now we are of course not the only one, and we are happy that humanitarian logistics is getting popular, that people are going also into this research field. So we are a research team, but also we are not only virtual platform, but also physical. So we are hosting researchers, we provide HUMLOG fellowships, so both practitioners and researchers are visiting us to work jointly on humanitarian logistics. We also accept the research. We also have a teaching, so one of the first master's courses on humanitarian logistics, as well as PhD, so 4-year course focused directly on humanitarian logistics. We work with practitioners, and of course we disseminate, we promote humanitarian logistics. For those of you who are academics, we are running Journal of Humanitarian Logistics and Supply Chain Management. So please read, please submit. There is now open special issue actually on the COVID and on the pandemics, so you can read more about it. What else really makes us different or special is actually that our very strong links with practitioners. So we'll work with UN agencies, we work with Humanitarian Logistics Association, which is the largest association of humanitarian logistics professionals, with Red Cross, Red Crescent, European Commission, and so on. And why I mention this is because simply our research is very close to practice. So we are additional resource for humanitarian organizations. So we work together, we apply together for funding, and our research is helping to solve the problems which were identified by humanitarian organizations. So what's about humanitarian logistics really? What it is and how to approach it? So first we need to understand that humanitarian logistics is a critical part of the humanitarian operations. Research indicates that between 70, even some research is 80% of total cost of humanitarian operations, humanitarian intervention is logistics. So very important factor. So the aim of humanitarian operations, and because of that also humanitarian logistics, is to relieve human suffering, simply saying to help people, to save life, to help to keep people healthy, to provide basics such as shelter, food, water, medical assistance. Then in this definition is also that usually takes place in the locations, in the areas where local authorities, local governments are unable to respond to provide assistance to the local populations. So when the local capacity is not enough, then humanitarian organizations are stepping up and helping in this area. But this is more, I would say, more narrow view, because the wider view is saying, and that's actually definition which I prefer to accept, that humanitarian logistics is helping people. So every situation which is not typical, everyday work, everyday logistics can be considered as humanitarian logistics. In a situation when the local capacity is not enough, when disaster strikes, we have to use our extra resources. And that's humanitarian logistics, helping people in need. So when we use the humanitarian logistics, where we really start to initiate it. So that's mainly in disaster response. So it's response to natural disasters. We have whole range starting from earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, large-scale fires, flooding, and so on. So those are disasters which are caused by nature. On top of that, we are having man-made disasters. Those are conflicts. We are talking about Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, and larger number of conflicts in different areas. When we look at the risk categories, when we look about supply chains, we can look at here from this, what is the cause, what is the source of the supply chain disruption. So those are usually internal threats, something which is going from within the supply chain. That is not common threat for the humanitarian logistics. Nevertheless, it still may happen. We can consider, for example, here the Lebanon explosion not long time ago, when the human mistake resulted in the huge blast which destroyed part of the city. That required humanitarian intervention in already area which is influenced by other issues. Then we have this, as I mentioned, natural external risk, those weather, disasters, flow, heavy snowfall, thunderstorms, hurricanes, and so on. We can here you can see several of them. Then we have already, as I mentioned, external to the supply chain and man-made. Those are which are caused by human. So as terrorist attacks, acts of war, we hear about a full-scale conflict, hybrid conflicts, local conflicts, everything which is caused by humans. So we have kind of differentiate between nature and the man activities, but in fact this is not so easy, this distinction, because we have to look when looking at the risk about the potential disasters, but also about speed, something which can happen very fast. We're talking sometimes about minutes, days, weeks, like earthquakes, tsunami, and flooding. versus the slow one, like drought, rise of water levels, climate change, something which is changing very slow or relatively slower than the rapid one, but requires also intervention. And then we are moving to the crisis, a so-called protracted crisis, when actually instability, crisis became a norm. It's no longer something exceptional, but it's the way how the environment is set up. Lack of stability, risk, very weak institutions, conflict, and on top of the conflict, we have still natural disasters, because when we have a conflict, doesn't mean natural disaster stops. Or if the other way around, actually complex emergencies, when we can see that the natural disaster or even longer term climate change may trigger a conflict. So we have complex emergency, which is very hard to solve looking only at humanitarian support. So we are moving to such so-called humanitarian development peace nexus, when we need the humanitarian intervention in case of, let's say, rapid onset disasters, but at the same time, we need development actions to be better prepared for disaster. I will talk about that in a moment, or also to respond to those slower disasters. And then we have a conflict, we need also peacemaking activities, peacekeeping activities, because without one of those, the other are not really, don't deliver long-term results. Short-term help, humanitarian help will not solve development problems. Without peace, we cannot have a development. And we are in the kind of cycle which is going up or down, because with one problem is causing the other, having so-called cascading effect I will talk about in a moment. But humanitarian intervention, humanitarian logistics will be typically for this rapid disaster, but not only, because it's also entering the area of humanitarian development when preparing for future disasters. So this is already what I mentioned, this cascading effect, the fact that disasters are linked, that one is causing the other, and we actually have a problem sometimes distinguish what is the cause, what is the effect. We have now papers looking at the pandemic spread in Yemen, which you can read on in a journal. But here is the other example. Let's say in one lack of rain in one area where it's resulting in a drought, the drought results local food shortages. That results to the local conflict. Local conflict can escalate to the cross-border war, which creates the further food shortages. There's lack of food for export. There is lack of income, and so on. So we have the whole chain of different events which may actually escalate, getting worse and worse. So the question is how we can really stop to avoid this domino effect, avoid this collapse. So when we intervene early enough, we may not have this escalation. The other example is more from commercial sector, from manufacturing. There is the earthquake that caused the tsunami, that's the electricity shortage, that's the production or parts production stopped, product assembling stopped, manufacturing stopped, and we may run, for example, out of medical equipment. Similar situation you could see in the COVID, what in stopping export from one place resulted in shortages in the other, together with increased demand, so another supply chain disruption. So this cascading effect we need to always keep in mind when we are thinking about humanitarian intervention. We are thinking about supply chain disruption in any cases, not only in humanitarian, but also in commercial settings. Of course, the risks are not equally distributed. Here is the global risk index from not long time ago. The darker countries, the darker region is the higher risks. And here is important to notice that risk is on one side the source of the risk, which I just mentioned. There could be areas which have more natural disasters, where we have more conflicts, but also we have the coping capacity, how the certain area, some certain place is prepared to cope with the disaster, to cope with disruption. I will return to this later. But we need to always remember about those sides, the risk of the disaster and the preparedness for it, the coping capacity. Because when we have another disaster like COVID hitting place which is already under conflict, which already has a problem, does the extra layer because the local systems, let's say local healthcare, is unable to cope with this extra burden. So there are certain areas which are more prone to disasters, and we need to recognize this when preparing the global humanitarian system for intervention. So now I refer to the disaster management cycle. So let's say we have a disruptive event, something happens, one of those disasters suddenly hit, which I mentioned you earlier. So in the cycle we have 3 or 4, depends on the version, phases. But firstly, before something happens with preparedness, we need to be prepared, or we should be prepared before even happens. And actually, if we are well enough prepared, then nothing really happens. Disaster is not a disaster. We may have lots of weather conditions when, let's say, water, the river was enough regulated, flood defenses were constructed, or river was not maintained natural. So there was simply no flooding, because preparedness allows us to avoid the disasters. But when something happens on the scale of disaster is larger than we expected, then we have emergency response. This is the moment when we have to trigger all the response mechanisms, when we need to make some actions. In many cases, actually, we don't know what to do, because infrastructure is destroyed, communication doesn't work, and that's a very messy time when you have too much information overflow or lack of information, but you need to make decision what to do, what should be delivered, to whom should be delivered, what order should be delivered, and how should be delivered. So this emergency response in time, when the time is critical. When you have earthquake, when you have some disaster, which is rapid disaster, you have just 48, 72 hours to take people out from the rubble, or provide them something when you have disasters such as, earthquake, at the same time winter, when it's simply minus cold outside. Very, very small window in many cases to respond. And after this immediate response, or we can divide this into 2 phases, we have recovery. Recovery means building lives, building new reality, rebuilding back to the old. But this old should at the same time learn from this current disaster to improve, to be better prepared, to learn. So that's the reason we're talking about the cycle here, that every disaster, every response should be a feedback, should provide feedback for preparedness stage, to be ready, to learn from mistakes, to respond better. So that's a disaster management cycle. How that work in practice? Here is an example from I would say the lowest level of preparedness from the family. This is a case from Sweden, the leaflet which was distributed all around Sweden before the COVID time, actually, which was telling people how to be better prepared for the crisis. That also includes the war. It was quite interesting because, like, during the Cold War, everybody was expecting the conflict between East and West, so the civil defense was at very high alert. There were procedures. Later, it was kind of slowly forgotten, but then couple of years ago, 5 years ago, this kind of brought back to the geopolitical situation. And one of the countries which responded was Sweden, which distributed this particular leaflet to every single household, to every single family in Sweden, including in a publication in English language. So how that works? So this preparedness, the disaster management cycle here at the local family level was about asking people what can happen around. So we are going back to this type of the risk which I mentioned earlier. What can happen? Can be a landslide, could be the flooding, could be any industrial accident. So analysis, thinking what can happen. Of course, when you think about the risk, like always we need to think about high probability. How probable is that something will happen? and what impact will be. And of course, we are most interested in these high probability, high impact areas. We are living in the area which is prone to fire, to the forest fire, middle of the dry season. That's something what we are getting prepared for. We know that fire is on regular basis. But actually, they're quite interesting, those low probability, high impact risks. So something may happen, we don't know when, but it has a huge impact. Interesting way is that after the pandemic started, I went through different preparedness plans from organizations all around the globe, looking at the country preparedness, city preparedness, regional preparedness. Most, if not all, organizations had some kind of pandemics listed. That could be with biohazards, that could be division between some sickness of the human versus animals. But so in fact, everybody had supposed to have a plan for the pandemics, but the reality was not exactly like that. Why? Because we expected pandemics, it will happen, but we didn't know when and we didn't know what scale. So the preparation wasn't really to the level as expected. And that similar things will happen with, with other risks that, the blackout or large internet crash, we expect it, but we don't know what will be scale and impact of it. So let's go back to our family preparation in Sweden. So after knowing what family has, what are the risks, they were asked to make a plan, how they will act, what they will do when they don't have the basic services, what they will do when the basic so-called lifeline don't work. There's no electricity, no heating, no water supply, no food supply, and so on. How to be prepared. And then we are moving actually to logistics at this very low scale. It means we need to have a prepositioning. We need to build your emergency stock and information flow. So in this case, at the home preparedness tips, the Sweden asked, what about food? Do you have enough food in case of emergency? What about water? What about warmth? What when is no electricity? Remember, Sweden, winter, cold country. And of course, what about communication? This is important because remember, supply chain and logistics is not only about flow of goods, it's also about flow of information, communication, and also flow of money, because mostly that's in the digital element. So even at this lowest level was about goods, what to keep, how much to keep, how often to rotate, and what is really needed for what time and for how many people. And the same principle is actually applied for humanitarian organizations. For that means international one, but also the emergency response organizations at the country level, supply chain, supply agencies, and so on. Why? Because preparedness is going from the bottom up. It's about how individual, how family is prepared for the risk and disaster. What about the society, city, village? How companies are prepared for supply chain disruption from different sources, as mentioned earlier. What about the regional and national level? How national authorities are prepared, the healthcare system, firefighters. What about cross-border cooperation? Some areas are, better, easier accessible from across the border than from the local area. What about the supply chain? How supply chain, healthcare supply chain, medical supply chains are prepared for disruption? And finally, about the humanitarian supply chain. How humanitarian organizations are prepared to respond to disasters. So it's going from the bottom up, from individual, from every one of us up to the humanitarian organization, the same level, analyzing the risk, think about plans, be prepared for time when the worst is coming. So what happens when we finally have this disaster? Remember the cycle. This is a bit in the linear form, but when we have this emergency event, we have this phase of immediate response. What already I mentioned, this time when you really need to preserve lives, when the focus is on basic support, about healthcare, medical assistance, about finding out people who needs support, about finding actually what is needed. Where are the peoples who may evacuate? Where they moved? Remember, there may not be any internet or phone connections working. And then after this early support with the sustaining people, we need to have a longer term support. In this case, we are moving from focus on time, on agility, on flexibility, on responsiveness, more towards the cost. How to be sure that what we do in the cost efficient manner, at the same time keeping in mind the main purpose of humanitarian logistics, mean helping beneficiaries. So here, those who are working supply chain will notice this duality of a supply chain. We have the extreme agility, extreme responsiveness, and creation of a supply chain almost from scratch, moving to the lean, highly optimized, more manufacturing like supply chain flow. So going back, human logistics and disaster, human logistics is really to deliver on time what is needed to those who need it most. Identifying those people, delivering them goods such as medicines, water, shelter, food, services that will be field hospitals, for example, damage assessment, search and rescue, and also infrastructure reconstruction, repair. The airports we need to bring to operations to bring the goods, energy supply should be restored, water supply, hospitals should be rebuilt and equipped. And that, of course, required typical, let's say, similar function as commercial logistics, means storage, procurement, planning, distribution, and so on, just in different contexts, in the environment, which is highly dynamic and frequently unknown because we have lack of information. So this is, in the essence of humanitarian logistics. So who is involved in that? We are talking really about very complex situation. In the commercial, we have different stakeholders and so on. In humanitarian, it's even more complicated because we have the governments, NGOs, aid agencies, donors, suppliers, because those goods have to be bought somewhere, service providers, transportation companies, simply saying, military, local police, and so on. So very complex, very hard to coordinate and manage environment. How it's done in practice, how it's actually been simplified, is the cluster approach. This is the UN agency, how they are divided. So they are simply divided into different sectors, into different areas. So they are responsible for provision of certain type of goods or services, like WHO is looking at the health, UNICEF at nutrition, UNICEF at protection, and so on. So this is kind of division to be sure that everything what is needed is delivered to the people. At the same time, this complexity and coordination is simplified. So those are some current issues which are now in the logistics. I will skip this one, but now I will move to the humanitarian logistics and the COVID. So as I mentioned here earlier, pandemic was expected to happen, but it was not expected. We didn't know when it will happen. There were some, of course, voices not heard that it will happen sooner or later. We had actually pandemics going on in different parts of the world, but they were regional. So this global pandemic was actually a surprise. And there was also discussion, is it really slow onset or fast onset disaster? So if we think about the scale, that is a global scale, actually we can say it was fast because the time to react was pretty slow if you compare the scale of it. So it was surprise because of it was relatively fast and the scale was global. And what was also very specific for it, that it was a global supply chain, influence on the global supply chain. Till now, we didn't have such a big influence on supply chains at the same time in the whole globe. We think about, tsunami in Japan, that was still cut part of the supply chain. If you even look at the Japan, only part of Japan was destroyed. Here, it was impact on the whole supply chain. And also it was important that COVID already was in the moment when the other things were happening. It was still time of natural disasters, conflict didn't cease, the local capacity wasn't rebuilt. So these pandemics have, at the same time, was kind of, remember this cascading effect, was element which is strengthening the current already problematic systems, and also showing inefficiencies, showing the weaknesses of the global supply chains, which we constructed as a very long, heavily offshore, heavily outsourced. And then actually, at the same time, there were some similarities with the humanitarian logistics, which maybe are not direct, but some issues which we could learn from humanitarian logistics, the issues which are maybe not as common in commercial supply chains, at least not on those which are working in relatively stable environments such as developed countries. So, for example, we had already Ebola vaccination program some years ago, and so we could learn about cold chain distribution. And actually, one of my students completed thesis on cold and vaccine supply chain before the and without any links with the COVID. So it was very useful research. Also, we can learn how to mobilize resources very fast, something which is not common in commercial settings. We could learn also we were learning how to set up extra medical facilities such as field hospitals, something which is unusual in the peaceful time in developed nations, set up drive-through centers for testings, setting up extra field hospitals that we could use, and actually we use the learning from humanitarian logistics, how to use the distribution from emergency stocks, because most of countries had to use the extra emergency stocks, and also distribute stuff which came from the emergency procurement, like this stuff, PPE equipment, which came from China. I was actually involved in designing and auditing such a supply chain in one of the countries. So can we really classify COVID-19 response of humanitarian operations? If we think about this kind of narrower view of humanitarian operations, humanitarian logistics, that in the areas that governments are unwilling or unable to support, not. But in practice, if we think about helping people, helping citizens in the area of unusual time when the local capacity is not enough to deal with the emergency, definitely yes. So COVID, even though it didn't fulfill all of the humanitarian logistics definitions, it was still emergency response. It was a disaster response, and it has similar characteristics as humanitarian logistics, but not all of them, because humanitarian organizations work actually frequently in much more dynamic, much more complex environment than we could witness in response to COVID in some places. Because remember, again, it differs between countries and between regions. That depends on the local coping capacity. So that's my last slide. So what's about humanitarian logistics? So it's focused on the saving lives. It's not a profit, it's about people, but still includes the basic logistics functions, planning, preparedness, procurement, warehousing, and so on. And also there is a growing need for human logistics. I think we will see more and more need for it, because we have growing number of disasters, climate change, let's think. We have a growing number of people affected, growth of populations, more people living in the cities. It means potentially higher number of beneficiaries, higher number of people in need. And also it's one of the most agile supply chains, most flexible, those who have to work really fast response, because the first 70 hours are critical. Great, so that was all. I have 35 minutes and I am in time. That's not often happening, but this time, yes. So if you want to know more, you can follow us on the social media. And thank you very much. Time for questions, answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Wojciech. I'm going to leave some time to people to sort of warm up and write their questions, but I have few questions for you, or maybe comments, more of a comment. it's really about the being pre-prepared, preparedness stage, which is very important. I mean, most people, when they think logistics, they don't think of procurement and provisioning as part of it, which is obviously very critical, right? I mean, you'll have to sort of, and it's not just about provisioning or procurement of food supplies, it's also of services, transport and that kind of a thing. So this is my first point. The second point, which is interesting again in preparedness, Fareed Zakaria has a very interesting book. It's called The 10 Lessons in the Aftermath of COVID-19. And in the very early chapters, he talks about health system readiness, the index that was actually prepared prior to the COVID-19. And interestingly enough, he was saying that the top country was the US. Now, guess what? The second country was the UK. And he was commenting that, interestingly enough, that when you look at how those two countries in specific performed vis-a-vis the COVID, they were miserable. And some of the other countries who were actually ranked very low, including China, for example, they fared much better. Now, the morale here is you're measuring in face of uncertainty. You're measuring something against a beast that you don't know how is it going to attack you, where is it going to attack you, which makes it tremendously hard. Now, I'm going to stop at here and just allow you to sort of answer and then take more questions and then maybe come back and ask you more questions.
I think that was exactly spotted on about the procurement. This was one of the slides which I was actually escaped in a matter of time. It's about one of the common topics is about the procurement localization, because it's not only about procure from the big suppliers, but also to procure from the local suppliers, to be sure that you rebuild the local market, how you can build the capacity of the regional smaller companies which are working in this area. So procurement, yes, but not only a procurement of those goods which are stored, but also how you can procure the production capacity that first you have the goods which you have somewhere in storage, and then you have the production which is going on. We remember still the basic issue of the problems of the inventory management. In humanitarian logistics, also the problem where to store it really, because if you're storing goods in the area which is prone to, let's say, flooding, you may actually your store can be destroyed, or your warehouses can disappear together with disaster. So you need to have both localization for the storage and also the means of how to transport it. But emergency procurement is definitely something which is a core here, and here we have this tendency on moving towards the local procurement from the local suppliers here. And the second comment about this, preparedness. First, I think we don't have all the data yet, but I think it's about trade-offs. It's about trade-offs between social element, healthcare preparedness, but also the political issues, the governance, approach to governance here. So to what extent, how you'll manage this event, say economic versus health issues. So this is like always, there is no easy choice. But I think there is definitely, as you pointed, there is definitely interesting learning, and also for us, for academics, some topics how to study really how organizations and countries responded to this crisis. Also looking at the healthcare preparedness and overall medical logistics here. That includes also training of people, because relatively it's easier to buy goods, but how to be sure that we have trained people who are there, nurses, people working in the social homes, the people who are really doing the job. It takes sometimes years to train them. Super.
I'm going to allow questions from the audience, and then I'm going to iterate back and forth. Vinette, do you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, in fact, my basic question is that, regarding the, that we are seeing that in certain countries, for example, in advanced countries, there's a lot of mitigation, preparedness, resiliency as far as, climate, disasters and all these natural, disasters, calamities that take place, for example, US, etc., etc. But in some of the, developing regions, for example, in Africa, etc., we see not that sort of, preparedness as far as, the governments are concerned, as far as policies are concerned, as far as drills are concerned, as far as some of the technologies are concerned. And my second point is that that we have seen with the certain disasters, for example, with the Fukushima disaster in Japan, and with the even with the Chernobyl in Russia, what disasters can certainly destroy certain a lot of industries, nuclear industries, and with that the future of the entire industry. So how can you avert that? Because on the one hand, man goes to the moon and etc. space, there's a lot of preparedness, but on the ground, we have massive research and etc., but still we are not able to avoid these calamities, for example, like Chernobyl, Fukushima, and they basically play havoc for decades, years, and basically can have a very dangerous consequences for science itself. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Again, two very good points. Here is, remember this slide about the difference between the humanitarian development. So if we go back to that, it's about money. In many cases, it's about money. When we have some big natural disaster or any event, it's really going into media. It's covered all over the world in the news. And what's the result? The money is flowing to as a relief for that disaster. This kind of things sell very well. But for the other one means the preparedness and about the mitigation, you need everyday small work, and also you need money. But this is not as visible as the natural disaster, but it requires money and it's investment. And there should be recognition that actually preparedness and development, or preparedness before the humanitarian event happens, is actually pays back, because you don't have the event, you don't have to react. But then again, if the money is going from two different sources, frequently we have this isolation between humanitarian money, which is ring-fenced humanitarian, versus the ring-fenced money for development. That's the reason why it's important, this discussion about development, humanitarian, peacekeeping, depends what order you have. But it's a very good point that where to get this money, where to get the money, that be sure that you don't have this need for humanitarian intervention. But that's only in the preparedness and thing. But this is something which it will not be solved, I think, easy, but that should be kept in mind. This humanitarian action should be followed by development. Then you mentioned those big risks, definitely going again, money, probability, and scale. We cannot prepare for everything. If we are prepared for, there are disasters, black swans that are happening, they are never, but nobody expected the scale, nobody expected the severity or speed. So we cannot be prepared for everything. And moreover, those are the so-called systemic risks which really change the world. And again, we are unable to be prepared for those too. So preparedness has certain limits, like here, pandemics. We were prepared, but it already over 1 year passed and we are still not out of it. So we cannot be for everything, but at least we can prepare for those smaller scale disasters, avoiding later this cascading effect here. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question here. I think it's from Marco Lombardi, but he wanted me to read it, so I will. What are the moral dilemmas of the highly volatile, insecure, and politicized environment where humanitarian aid risks to be instrumentalized?
That's a tough question. There is a paper by one of my colleagues who look at different type of the organizations, but if you look at the mandate of the most of the agencies that about UN Red Cross, the ideas that you provide help to people. So you don't look at the origin, you don't look at the political element, you treat everybody equally. So those are the humanitarian principles. And of course, there is a risk that they will be politicized because, again, there is a discussion, you know, who provides the health support for people. If you have the humanitarian organizations, they have very strong view on this, that they have to keep independence, they have to keep their own principles, and in some cases actually withdraw from the certain area when they feel that they are unable to work under condition when they feel that they is in line with their view. But on the other side, we have the actions which are for the local people, which are not considered by, at least from one side, as a humanitarian intervention. Let's say the initiative, for example, by military with the aim is no heart and minds, but they are still providing some support for the local communities. But the purpose are kind of dual purposes here: support and the political element there to gain certain goals which are determined in the longer term. So I think we cannot avoid bringing this political element into discussion, and the reason is very simple, because remember the slide about involvement of the organization. There are always local governments. There are often organizations which are on the ground, which may not be recognized. One side doesn't recognize the other, but organizations have to operate in such dynamic environment. So the independence and equal treatment of everyone is a priority for humanitarian organizations, but there are of course different actors in this field, and there is always risk, and that's the reason why these operations are in the complex emergencies are so complex, I would say. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna come back and ask questions myself. It's always very interesting. I mean, in supply chains in general, you look at the trade-offs or the interplay or the balance between speed and efficiency, between timeliness and delivering at cost. Now, even it is arguable that even in humanitarian logistics, early on, you really have to go in a surge. You really have to get it at any cost. Hopefully, if you're prepared, you can do this in an efficient way, relatively efficient way, but initially it's about speed. It's about getting there on time. As things progresses, you can probably get into more phase type deployment where you can start thinking in terms of costs. I just want to get your views about this.
The initial, as you said, the initial stage of it's about time. It's about time. It's about this, first 72 hours, but also some other crises where the crisis takes longer time. The cost is really the secondary issue. And I had discussions about it, and the people just tell me, it's very simple. If I don't deliver those goods into this place, this number of people will die. And that's a measure. That's a very good measure. We had a paper on performance metrics, and actually one of the performance metrics in humanitarian logistics, which are also reported, is about number of people saved, number of lives, because you can say the mortality rate among children before and after intervention. So though this is a very tricky measure, and how that reflect that one in cost. So there are definitely actions which the saving lives is the critical thing. Let's think about using the airdrops, frequent use of the air transportation, the most expensive mode of transportation, low volume, relatively low volume, low weight, and so on. But nevertheless, this is the priority. So first action is about speed. The second is, as you pointed, more looking at the costs and optimizing it. And again, is when you have ad hoc created supply chain, when you have the first reaction, you don't know really what to optimize because supply chain is not set up yet. Only when you set up the supply chain, when you know more or less how it looks, you know how you can map it, then the next stage will be to optimize it. But the first stage, as is pointed, is speed, is time. because time is saving lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Marco, please unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Just want to ask, because we didn't touch pretty much sustainability. And I would like to know what is very briefly, the position of HUMLOG, and if they believe that perhaps modeling and system dynamics is going to be the solution provider, or either the approach is going to be more conservative, just by asking a panel of experts and eventually factorizing and prioritizing whatever is found by the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so actually there are two questions. So again, good that I skipped the current issues in supply and humanitarian logistics, because one of those 4 or 5 what I put there is a sustainability. By sustainability here, I mean environmental aspects here. So this is something which is emerging, which is already visible among humanitarian supply chain community. We have projects which are working on that. So yes, there is already things, you need to help people, but at the same time, you have to have minimum impact on environment. This is in fact, brings a lot of discussion. Let's say, obviously you need to speed, you need air transportation, but it's not environmentally friendly, but still you don't have choice. And another example is use of the plastic, like the plastic sheets for the tarps and so on, packaging and so on. But sustainability is definitely on the agenda, but I would say it's an emerging topic. The second question is about systems dynamics. We have a paper on Yemen where we use systems dynamics. We have now also current work use systems dynamics. So from my view, it's a really good tool, because with systems dynamics, you're going away from this linear view. You have all those loops, negative, positives, even though it's in fact very hard to quantify what the impacts are, but at least you can visualize the complex interlinks interaction between different variables. So the tool can be used for education, for decision making at strategic levels, just to identify and to visualize this complex environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to come back and ask you another question. You said an important part of the delivery part is the coordination. Now, when you look at coordination in humanitarian logistics, there is a concept of a logistics cluster, which is hosted by the WFP. I really don't understand, what do they do exactly? If you can give me a little bit more of an info. What is the logistic cluster WFP? And is that the only type of a coordination platform that is there?
So they are the main one for the whole group of the agencies. They are the one responsible for logistics. However, the logistics to some extent is within our other clusters. So there should be cooperation between those two. So we are now working, for example, with UNHCR. They also have some elements, planning. For example, they need to plan what is the demand. They need the inventory management. There is a logistics element also in the shelter cluster. We have courses. Actually, colleagues of mine are running some training with them. So WFP is the main one. Actually, you also remember that's the Nobel Prize winner. They got they are for them the logistics is the core, but bit of logistics actually with all other clusters. Think about the wash cluster. The spare parts for, let's say, maintaining the water supply system. That's again the logistics element. So logistics, even though is a core, it still spreads to the other agencies. However, when you think about the coordination, that's within the cluster, we have also the links of the smaller NGOs, as different agencies which are working in the ground, but still it's a complex, because this area can be very, very fragmented, and some of the local implementing partners may have very little experience. Like I had a paper for example, the search in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, in the beginning, there was nobody who had experience in the humanitarian work, say they have to kind of bottom up create the organizations and introduce them into this wider humanitarian response system. Thank you.
Super. Well, I mean, I guess I'm not seeing any more questions. So I really wanna, at this stage, I wanna really thank you. Here is another, here's a guy. Okay. Mu'min.
Last chance.
Please, I'm gonna unmute, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. First of all, I would like to thank you for this very informative session. And my question is about following the procurement procedure. As you know, there is a trade-off between following the procurement procedure during the time of crisis.
Muhammad, we're losing you. We cannot hear you properly. Can you just say your question again, please, slowly?
How would you maintain this balance?
Balance between what? We cannot hear you, Muhammad.
Can you hear me, Dr. Ali?
No.
Your voice is very, very far. Could you just write it? Could you just write your question?
That will be easier because I cannot catch.
Just type your question, please. Are you done?
I can't see any question here, at least.
You might send it to the one of the hosts, other hosts.
Yes, it's a trade-off between following the.
Please go ahead, read it and
Okay, I can read it now. So the question is about trade-off between procurement procedures during the time of crisis and responding quickly to people's needs. I would say it's not the issue of the trade-off, because if you design your emergency procurement, it's by definition called emergency procurement. So you have flexible enough emergency procurement procedures that there is that you can just follow them. If something is wrong, it means your procedures are not proper and you need to revise them. So it's not a trade-off, it's the issue of how you construct your procurement procedures. And of course, of the having an emergency stock. So before you initialize your emergency procurement, you have enough stock to fulfill these initial needs. Thank you.
Okay. At this stage, I think I will conclude. I really want to thank you for a very insightful webinar, great discussion. And I thank you all for participating in this webinar. And I look forward to seeing you next week. On Monday, we're going to have, at 3 o'clock, we're going to have Surya Deva, Associate Professor. He is a School of Law, City University of Hong Kong. He's going to talk about a very interesting topic, gender bias and new technologies. What should business do? On Wednesday, we're going to have at 7 p.m. Professor Raymond Sainer from Basel. He's going to talk about business diplomacy. I really want to thank Wojciech for being with us. It has been really very informative for me, and I hope it was informative for the rest of us about a very interesting topic, humanitarian logistics. Thank you all. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you in future events. Thank you, Wojciech.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. It was really a pleasure to be there. Thank you for the invitation. And if you have any additional questions, issues, just email me, contact HUMLOG.
Sure, I will. And if you don't mind, if I can get the slides, we can share it with the audience also, with the participants.
Of course.
Thank you. Take care now.